On the first call, they didn't even try to pretend it was a collaboration. "You're here to watch, not speak," the producer said, his tone flat but final, like a door clicking shut in my face. No introduction, no warm welcome, just an instruction, stripped of courtesy, delivered in the same voice you might use to tell someone to stay behind the rope at a museum. I swallowed hard, the taste of that sentence settling like dust in my mouth. My square on the screen was small, gray, and muted. My name in white letters, my camera off because I hadn't been invited to exist visually. Around me, the others filled the space with overlapping voices, confident interruptions, laughter that carried the kind of ease you can only have when you believe you belong. They threw half-formed plot twists back and forth, juggled timelines sloppily, stitched together character arcs with visible seams. I could see the holes in the floorboards of the story they were building, gaps so wide a viewer could fall through. But no one asked me to point them out. That wasn't my role. I was here for my eyes, not my voice. The truth is, I had waited too long to be in this room, any room where a story was being made, to risk being ejected before I'd even taken my coat off. So I told myself it was worth it, even on their terms, even with my mouth closed and my ideas caged. I forced my hands to stay still, even as my fingers itched to unmute and fix the dialogue they kept breaking. Instead, I began keeping notes. Not the collaborative, share with the team kind, but the kind you write when you know no one's ready to hear you yet. A private ledger of missed beats, better lines, cleaner transitions. I wrote in the margins like a ghost editor haunting their draft. Each page of my notes was a little rebellion, built in silence. I kept timestamps. I rewrote exchanges. I rebuilt scenes in my head that would never exist in theirs. Not yet. I told myself I was only preserving ideas so they wouldn't get lost. But the truth was uglier. I didn't trust them to carry this story where it needed to go. Not because they were incompetent, though the cracks were showing, but because I could already feel the hunger in the room, the kind that devours credit before the work is even done. The call dragged on for 2 hours. I spoke once to say hello at the start and once more at the end, to say thank you in a voice so small it barely felt like mine. When it was over, I sat in the dark laptop screen dimming, cursor blinking in an empty chat window. I could have typed something, a suggestion, a question, even a joke, but I didn't, because this wasn't the moment to make noise. This was the moment to protect the only thing I'd been given, a fragile key, paper thin, to a locked door I had been knocking on for years. Keys like that tear easily. So I pressed save on the file, shut the laptop, and leaned back in my chair. They'd asked me to turn my voice off. Fine. I'd keep it burning low, in a place no one could touch, waiting for the day they'd be forced to hear it whether they wanted to or not. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Please write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. The nights became my real workspace. While they slept, or at least pretended to, I sat hunched over my desk, the glow of my screen carving shadows into the walls. Every scene they left unfinished, I stitched together. Every timeline they bent out of shape, I straightened. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't paid, and it wasn't acknowledged. But it was necessary, and for some reason I felt responsible, as though the story itself had chosen me to keep it from falling apart. The worst parts weren't the blank pages. Those could be filled. It was the near misses, the moments where a line almost landed but collapsed just short of truth. The character arcs that started to rise only to drop dead because no one bothered to see them through. I treated those fractures like broken bones, aligning them in the dark, binding them with quiet precision, so that when the rest of the team returned, the injury was invisible. They would never know it had been broken, and they would certainly never know who had healed it. Hours bled into each other. I forgot to eat. My coffee went cold and stayed that way. The clock became a kind of enemy, not because it moved too fast, but because it reminded me of how much life I was pouring into something I couldn't even claim. The more I repaired, the clearer the story became. The clearer the story became, the louder their voices sounded in the group calls. Confident, polished, certain. They carried my work in their mouths without realizing it, and each time they spoke, I could hear my fingerprints on their words. In the group chat, my name appeared rarely. When it did, it was attached to small, forgettable labels. Could you send this to the assistant? Let's have the assistant check the continuity. Not writer, not editor, not architect. Assistant. As if my only job was to carry trays of someone else's ideas from one end of the room to the other. But in my private folders, the truth was intact. I had dated every version, stored every draft, kept the raw footage of the moments before the repairs, not to expose anyone, at least not yet, but to remind myself that I wasn't imagining it, that my work was real, even if my name wasn't. There's a strange kind of silence in doing work no one is supposed to see. It's heavier than ordinary quiet, like standing under water, feeling the weight of the sea press against your ribs. Every night, I told myself I could walk away, close the files, let them drown in their own unfinished sentences. But I didn't, because some part of me believed that if I just held it all together long enough, someone, somewhere, would notice the invisible hands holding up the roof. They didn't. Not yet, but the roof stayed up, and that was enough for now. The promise came casually, almost lazily, as if it cost him nothing to say it. We were wrapping up another call when the producer's voice cut through the noise, directed only at me. He said the credit would come, not now, of course, but later, once things were finalized. The words sounded like reassurance, but they had the hollow weight of something rehearsed too many times. A placeholder sentence, not a commitment. I nodded into the quiet of my own room, pretending to believe him because in that moment I needed. A week later, the announcement went up. The big reveal of the creative team behind the project. They posted it like a celebration, a bright graphic on the internal message board, names lined up neatly in bold letters, the way you frame a photograph before hanging it on a wall. I scanned the list once, quickly, then again, slower, my eyes moving down the column as if my name might simply be hiding between the lines. But it wasn't there, not even in the smallest print. Beneath the post, someone had already typed it out. Technical error. 2 words meant to erase the sting, but they did nothing to dull it. An error is a typo. An error is a missing comma. This wasn't an error. This was omission dressed in polite language. This was a decision. I sat staring at that screen for longer than I'd like to admit, my hand hovering over the keyboard, not to type but to steady myself. I could feel the flush creeping up my neck, the heat that comes when humiliation finds you in private and still manages to make you feel exposed. I had fixed their broken scenes, patched their sinking arcs, given them the scaffolding to hold their story upright, and now, to the world inside that board, I didn't exist. A small part of me wanted to reply right there, under that thread, to point out exactly which errors of theirs I had cleaned up, to attach the before and after files and let the contrast speak for itself. But I didn't. I closed the page instead, the way you close a door you can't yet afford to open. That night I worked again. I told myself it was because the story deserved it, because I couldn't stand to see it collapse under the weight of their carelessness. But the truth was messier. I worked because stopping would feel like letting them win, and I wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. So I kept going. I cut lines that dragged, shifted scenes into their rightful order, rebuilt characters they had flattened. And as I worked, a thought took root, slow and stubborn. Promises were as fragile as paper, but paper could still hold proof, and I was keeping every scrap. It happened on a Tuesday, when the official trailer dropped. I hadn't been told the date. No one thought to include me in that loop. But the link appeared in the team chat, followed by a flurry of exclamation points and celebratory gifs. I clicked out of habit, prepared to watch their version of the story, to see which parts had survived intact and which had been ground down into marketable nothing. The music swelled, the cuts came fast, and then there it was, my scene. The one I had wrestled with for weeks, refining it until every beat landed, every pause held just long enough to ache. I had built it word by word, frame by frame, like a cathedral no one else cared to visit while it was still scaffolding and dust, and now it stood in the center of their parade. But in the bright, polished world of the trailer, my name was nowhere near it. Another's was, their signature, stamped like a seal across something I had poured my nights into. It wasn't subtle. It was placed there deliberately, the way you might hang a ribbon on a trophy you didn't earn, certain no one will question it. The team reacted instantly, their joy erupting in the chat. Congratulations flew toward the wrong person. Praise stacked in the wrong direction. I watched it pile up, brick after brick, building a monument to someone else with the foundation I had laid. I didn't say a word. My cursor hovered over the reply box once, twice, then fell away. There's a kind of silence that hides you, and there's a kind that cuts. That day I learned the second. I let my absence speak for me, not because I was afraid, but because speaking would have wasted breath on people who had already decided whose voice mattered. Behind the quiet, something inside me shifted. It wasn't rage. Rage is too hot, too quick to burn out. This was colder, denser, like a piece of iron settling deep into the machinery. A deliberate obstruction. A promise to myself that I would not forget the moment my own creation was paraded under a stranger's name. That night, when the trailer began spreading online, I didn't watch it again. Instead, I opened my original file, the uncut, unpolished draft, with every tracked change, every timestamp, every late-night note still clinging to the edges. I read it through, slowly, as if reminding myself that the work was real and it was mine, no matter what the credits or the clapping said. I learned something else, too. If they could steal a scene in plain sight, they could take anything. So I started holding my words tighter, shaping them in ways only I would recognize, leaving fingerprints invisible to anyone but me. I wasn't ready to fight them outright, but I was done feeding them without a trace. If they wanted my work, they'd have to choke on the knowledge that somewhere quietly it still belonged to me. The email arrived without warning, its subject line neat and bloodless. Agreement attached. No greeting, no context. Just the document waiting, like a door I hadn't asked to open, but somehow knew I would walk through. I clicked it, half expecting to see my role properly defined at last, a title that matched the work I had already done in silence. Instead, the first page named me consultant. The word sat there like a mislabeled specimen in a glass case, technically present, but stripped of its truth. The terms were colder still, a fee so small it was almost insulting. The kind of number you give when you want to make clear that the money isn't the point, that your contribution is worth almost nothing in their eyes, and then the weight. A non-disclosure agreement, thick with clauses, each one written to lock my mouth shut. Not just about the project, about the process, the authorship, the decisions behind the curtain. They weren't buying my time, they were buying my silence. For a long moment I stared at the signature line without moving. My cursor hovered there, trembling with the urge to close the window entirely. I could refuse. I could send back a note that my name deserved to stand where the work had been done. But the truth was that the ending of this story, their story, was dangling by threads I had woven, and no one else in that room had the hands to tie them off without letting the whole thing unravel. I thought about the nights I'd spent mapping the last act, about the single scene that could shift the weight of the entire narrative if it was done right. I thought about what it would become in their hands without me. Hollow, brittle, something that might shatter on contact with an audience. And then I thought about the version I could build if I stayed, even on their terms. So I signed, not out of loyalty to them, but to the work itself. Not because I accepted the insult of consultant, but because I couldn't bear to watch the ending collapse. The pen stroke was quick, almost careless on the surface, but it felt like pressing my thumb into wet cement, knowing the mark would stay long after the rest of the surface hardened. When I sent the document back, the acknowledgement was as brief as the offer. A single line of receipt, no warmth, no thanks. But I didn't need their gratitude. What I needed was time, just enough to finish what I had started in the shadows. And if the price of that time was binding myself to a contract that tried to erase me, then so be it. In my own files, I added a new folder that night. Final Cut. Inside it, I placed my latest draft, the one no one had seen yet, the one that would carry my fingerprints in every line. If they were going to keep me invisible, then I would make sure invisibility became my shield. Let them take the credit. The truth was already written where no NDA could touch it. I began keeping the diary without fully deciding to. It started as a scatter of files, a folder within a folder, nothing more than a place to drop old drafts so I could trace my steps if I needed to. But over time it became deliberate, almost ritual. Each night after I closed the script we were all pretending to be shaping together, I would open my own document, my record, and set down the facts. Not opinions, not arguments, just the unvarnished sequence of what had happened, preserved before anyone else could bend it. I logged the dates of every change, the hour a scene was altered, the precise time a line I'd written appeared in a shared file with someone else's initials on it. I saved screenshots of email threads, full transcripts of chat exchanges, copies of every file in both its raw and revised forms. Not because I wanted to use them against anyone, at least not then, but because I knew how this kind of story always played out. One day, when it suited them, the narrative would shift, memory would grow soft at the edges, contributions would blur, and when that happened I needed something that didn't fade. The diary became heavier with each passing week, not in size but in gravity. There was something about seeing it accumulate, the quiet proof of every unseen labor, that made the weight of my invisibility bearable. In those pages, I existed without question. My voice was there in tracked changes, my fingerprints in the metadata. It didn't matter if the meeting notes erased me, if the team bios never mentioned my name. Here, in my own archive, I was undeniable. I wrote in a tone stripped of emotion, even when my hands shook. It was important that this record couldn't be accused of bias. Just the time, the action, the file, the fact. The moments I felt most wronged were the moments I wrote with the most restraint. If they ever read it, and I didn't plan for them to, they would find no rants, no accusations, just a clean map of the truth they had tried to scatter. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, I'd scroll back through earlier entries and feel the gap between then and now like a change in air pressure. The optimism of those first weeks looked naive from here. I could see exactly when the tone of my notes shifted, when the work stopped being a gift and became a defense. That turning point was marked not by what I wrote, but by what I stopped writing. No more maybe they didn't notice, no more I'm sure it will even out. The record hardened there, becoming not just a memory but a kind of anchor, keeping me from drifting into the version of events they would one day try to hand me. I didn't know yet if I was building a shield or a weapon, maybe both. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever they decided the story was, my version wouldn't vanish. Not from my hands. Not from the pages that were growing, quiet and unshakable, while the official script kept changing under other people's names. It was supposed to be just another checkpoint, another muted seat in the dark, where my presence wouldn't be announced. The invitation to the closed screening hadn't even come directly to me. It was forwarded by accident, a line in a chain of messages that made it clear I was an afterthought. I told myself it didn't matter. I was used to existing in the margins of this project. But as the lights dimmed and the first frame appeared on the screen, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the mix of anticipation and dread that comes from watching something you've built pass through other people's hands. The room was full, but hushed, the kind of quiet that isn't about respect but calculation, as if everyone was here to decide what they could still change before release. I knew the scenes well enough to predict the rhythms, the cuts, the swells of music. And then we reached it, the moment I'd buried so deep I was almost certain they'd never find it. My line, the one I never submitted in an editable draft, the one I'd only read aloud once in a private rehearsal, my voice low and steady. They'd asked for it, I'd refused, and somewhere along the way, I thought it had been forgotten, but there it was. The hero stood center frame, his face holding the weight of everything that had come before, and he spoke the words exactly as I had written them, not cleaned up, not altered, but whole. A line I had carved out of my own ribs, so precise that changing even a syllable would have cracked it. Hearing it now was like feeling a pulse under my fingertips. The air in the room shifted. Conversations stilled. Even the rustle of paper from the back row stopped. In that suspended silence, I understood something I hadn't before. This story had crossed a line. It was no longer just a project I'd been dragged into under the title of consultant. It wasn't theirs in the way they thought it was either. Somehow, without permission, it had fused itself to me. The hours I'd poured into it, the battles I'd fought quietly in drafts no one else would ever see, all of it had stopped being just labor. It had become something living, something tethered to me in a way no credit line or absence of one could undo. I didn't smile. I didn't look around to see who was watching. I simply sat back, feeling the lines settle into the scene the way a final brick falls into place in a wall you've been building in secret. They might never admit where it came from, might never know how much it cost me to keep it mine until this moment. But here it was, spoken aloud in a room that could not take it back. For the rest of the screening, I barely registered the story as they'd shaped it. I was still holding on to that stillness, that brief ripple when the room breathed with my words in its mouth. They didn't know it, but I did, and that was enough to keep me steady. Because in that instant, I knew there were parts of this work they could never strip from me, no matter how many times they tried to write me out. It came less than 24 hours before the premiere, in an email stripped of ceremony. No greeting, no apology, just a flat instruction, hidden behind polite phrasing. Attendance was not aligned with the format of the event. That was the phrase they chose, as if the problem were architectural, logistical, anything but personal. It was the kind of language designed to sound harmless while removing you completely. I read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to feel the weight of each word pressing me out of the room. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be met with silence, or with the kind of corporate politeness that pretends it's not cutting you off. But as I closed the message, a different notification bloomed across my screen. A news alert. I clicked. Not out of curiosity, but reflex. And there it was, an interview with the sole author of the project. His face dominated the page, smiling under a headline that gave him everything. The quotes were even worse. Every insight, every choice, every risk, all claimed as his. My hours, my structure, my words, recast as his process, his brilliance. I read until the words blurred, the voice in the article pulling further and further away from the truth. There was no room for me in that story, not even a shadow. It was as if I had never existed in the making of it at all. And in the space where my phone should have been lighting up with messages, a stray apology, an awkward explanation, even the hollow reassurance of, "You'll be there in spirit," there was nothing. My inbox stayed empty. The chat threads were silent. No one reached out. It was a different kind of betrayal than the others. The first had been erasure in a list. The second, theft in the open. But this was exile. Not just from the credit or the applause, but from the very act of seeing the work completed. They weren't content to take the story. They wanted to take my witness to it as well, as if removing my eyes from the room could undo the fact that I'd been there at all. That night, I didn't work. I didn't open my files or make notes. I sat with the stillness, the hum of the computer fading in the corner, and let the understanding sink in. This was not neglect or oversight. This was a choice. They had built a stage for one, and the easiest way to make that stage look natural was to pretend the rest of us had never stepped onto it. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. Those feelings had been spent long ago, on smaller cuts that had already taught me what they were capable of. Instead, I filed the day away in the record I kept. Date, time, exact wording of the exclusion, link to the interview, full transcript saved offline. Another fact added to the chain, another knot in the rope I was quietly braiding. Somewhere out there, the premiere would happen without me. Lights, applause, speeches. But I knew that absence leaves its own kind of mark, not always visible, but felt in the places where the truth is missing. And in my own archive, that truth was not missing at all. The temptation was there, sharp, immediate, almost intoxicating. I could have done it in minutes, zipped the drafts, attached the track changes, sent them rippling through the right inboxes, posted the unedited scenes where anyone could see the fingerprints that didn't match the names in the credits. The story would have told itself. The internet loves a theft exposed. There would have been outrage, think pieces, strangers defending me without ever knowing me. It would have burned brightly, maybe even beautifully, and then it would have burned out. I didn't want a fire. Fires are too easy to dismiss once the smoke clears. I wanted something that couldn't be erased when the news cycle shifted. Something colder, slower, precise. So instead of detonating what I had, I curated it. I spent hours building the folder, moving each file into place, naming them not with emotion, but with facts. Date, time, version, checksum. Every change was documented, every thread of correspondence paired with the work it referred to, each artifact preserved in the sequence it had lived. When it was done, the folder felt heavier than its digital weight. It was the story behind the story, stripped of performance, reduced to undeniable lines of evidence. I didn't post it. I didn't leak it to journalists. I sent it to one person only, my lawyer. The email was brief, clinical, no trace of the heat I felt in my chest. The act itself was the message. It wasn't surrender, it was positioning. I knew that once the noise of the premiere died down, once the rush of self-congratulation had cooled, there would come a time when the truth mattered, maybe in a boardroom, maybe in a negotiation, maybe somewhere quieter. And when that moment came, I wouldn't have to argue. I would simply have to open the folder. In choosing silence, I found a strange kind of control. They could keep speaking, telling their version until they believed it was the only one. They could parade their sole author narrative in interviews and at festivals. But every time they did, they were stepping further onto ground I had already marked, whether they realized it or not. My evidence didn't shout. It waited. And waiting is sometimes the sharpest blade you can hold. That night I closed my laptop without checking the news. Whatever they were saying no longer mattered to me in the same way. I had shifted the weight from them to me without them even noticing. Let them think I was gone. Irrelevant. Silenced. The truth was that I had just moved my voice somewhere they couldn't touch it. Somewhere it would be ready when the exact right moment came to use it. The night of the premiere arrived dressed in light and noise. Outside, the street glowed with camera flashes, the red carpet pulling a clean, unwavering line through the crowd. Laughter rose and fell like waves, each burst carried by voices that had learned to speak in the rhythm of interviews. I stood apart from it all, not behind velvet ropes, but in the shadow of the entrance, far enough to be unseen, close enough to watch. The role they'd given me at the start, observer, silent, fit again, though now it felt less like an assignment and more like a vantage point. They moved past me in small clusters, each dressed in fabric that caught the light like it was made for this moment. Every step was measured, every expression practiced. Compliments bloomed in the air about the vision, the genius, the artistry, all of it tied to words I had written in the cramped quiet of my kitchen. I remembered the nights I had sat at that table, the coffee cooling beside me, the page glowing in the dark. The cadence of those lines had come from a mind no one here had invited into the photographs. Yet here they were, spoken as if they had been born in the bright rooms these people inhabited. From where I stood, the premiere looked like a play within the story I'd helped to build, a performance about a performance. They laughed at anecdotes that weren't theirs, recited insights they hadn't earned, smiled at praise for work they hadn't done. And as they walked into the building, each one stepped over the invisible threshold where my presence ended and their spotlight began. Inside the theater, I kept to the back, the shadows deeper here than outside. I didn't want a seat in the rows where hands would meet in applause. I wanted to see it from the edges, to feel the distance between the work as it was made and the spectacle it had become. The music swelled, the lights dimmed, and the first scene lit up the screen. The audience reacted to lines I knew by heart, laughing in the right places, falling silent in others. It should have been gratifying. Instead, it was like watching someone else wearing my coat. Familiar in shape, alien in presence. The words were mine, but their journey here had stripped them of the struggle that had shaped them. I didn't clap when the credits rolled at the end. I didn't move right away either. I waited until most of the audience had risen, the aisles filling with voices already discussing after-parties and photo ops. Only then did I step forward, past the seats, down the aisle, and toward the exit, always just outside the circle of light. The red carpet was empty now, its brightness cooled, its purpose spent. I crossed it without ceremony, each step unrecorded, unremarked. No cameras turned, no one called my name. And yet, somewhere deep in the quiet I carried with me, I knew the truth of that night was heavier than the spectacle it had staged. They could keep their lights. I had kept something they didn't even realize I still held. The last scene faded, its final notes dissolving into the air, and the theater sank into that heavy pause before the lights decide whether to rise. The applause began somewhere in the middle rows, polite at first, then swelling as more hands joined. I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on the screen, waiting for the moment I'd learned to brace for, the roll of names that would confirm the quiet erasures I had carried through the project. The music softened to a low hum, then slipped away entirely, leaving only the faint hiss of the speakers. The black screen bloomed, and white letters began their climb. It was strange how slow they seemed to move, as if the film itself knew the power of the names it carried. Each one appeared crisp, unshakable, certain of its right to be there. My jaw tightened, the metallic taste rose in my throat, sharp and familiar, the way it always did before another small loss. I had lived this moment enough times to know what came next. The slow scan, the inevitable absence, the private confirmation that I was nowhere to be found. Row by row, department by department, the credits carried the same faces I had seen smiling on the red carpet, the same voices that had filled interviews with ownership. I told myself not to look for mine, not to fall into the reflex that still hoped. It was easier to expect nothing than to feel the drop of recognition when it wasn't there. Still, my eyes tracked each frame, and with every name that wasn't mine, the air in my lungs grew heavier. Around me, the audience shifted, already gathering coats, speaking in low tones about favorite moments, about scenes that had stayed with them. My scene, the one they didn't know was mine, would be among them. The thought should have been enough. It wasn't. The credits kept climbing. I could feel the pull toward the exit now. The whisper to leave before the last frame erased me entirely. But my body stayed still, anchored by something I couldn't name. My hand closed into a fist against my leg, the nails biting into my palm until the taste of iron was joined by the slow burn of skin breaking. The letters glowed in the dark, indifferent to the weight they carried or the weight they denied. And somewhere just beneath the noise of shuffling feet I heard my own heartbeat, steady, deliberate, unbroken. I didn't know yet if the screen would let me disappear again. But I stayed, rooted in the moment, willing to watch it happen one more time, if only to feel the truth of it against my chest. It happened when I had already begun to let go, when my eyes were drifting from the screen toward the aisle, ready to stand, ready to disappear before the lights erased the shadows. The columns of names kept climbing, steady as a pulse, and I was already bracing for the end, for the soft, familiar confirmation that I was nowhere in the story's official memory. And then, without warning, the pattern broke. The screen flashed to a heading, story by, and there it was, my name, clean, uncontested, not in a cluster with others, not buried in a block of small print, but standing alone in its own quiet frame. For a second I thought I'd imagined it, that my mind had conjured the words in the place where I needed them to be. But the air in the room told me otherwise. It changed, sharp and electric, as if every person had taken the same breath at once. The applause thinned into silence, not abrupt but gradual, the way sound fades when attention shifts entirely. I saw it in the subtle movements, shoulders stiffening, heads tilting, the pause in the shuffle of coats. A few seats ahead, someone turned to glance behind them, their eyes searching the darkness, but it was too late. I was already watching them, unseen. The moment was small in length, but vast in weight. The letters on the screen glowed against the black, my name carved into that space with the kind of permanence that credits are meant to carry. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't kindness. It was compliance with something undeniable. The paper trail they couldn't erase. The facts they couldn't bend without breaking, and because of that, it meant more. I felt no rush of triumph, no swell of vindication. It was something colder, heavier. Not victory, but proof. Proof that all the nights, the silence, the restraint had led to this, the acknowledgement they had fought to avoid, delivered not with fanfare, but with inevitability. I thought of the folder in my possession, the drafts, the timestamps, the diary of every decision. This credit wasn't generosity. It was the moment their story and mine could no longer be separated. No one applauded when my name appeared. They didn't have to. The stillness was louder. I let it fill me for as long as the letters stayed on the screen, committing every second to memory. And when it finally dissolved into the next block of names, I knew it didn't matter how fast the rest of the credits rolled. That frame had been seen. It couldn't be unseen. I didn't learn the reason that night. The theater emptied, the carpet cooled, the echoes of applause dissolved into the street. And still, I didn't know why my name had appeared where I had long stopped expecting it. It wasn't until days later, when the noise around the premiere had begun to fade, that the truth arrived. Quiet, almost casual, as though it had been waiting for me to stop asking the wrong questions. My lawyer called in the early evening, his voice carrying none of the satisfaction I thought this news might bring. He told me there had been no confrontation, no threats, no dramatic exchange in a conference room. He had not argued, had not cornered anyone, had not even raised his voice. He had simply sent them a packet. The drafts, the originals, the version histories, the timestamps, each piece lined up in order like a ledger no one could dispute. He didn't dress it with accusations or demands, just the truth, laid bare in its simplest form. There was a stillness on the line after he said it, the kind that lets words settle until their shape becomes clear. They hadn't chosen me. They had chosen the one thing they couldn't afford to ignore, the truth embedded in the metadata, in the invisible fingerprints of creation. Those files had told the story better than I ever could have shouted it. And the platform, faced with a choice between preserving the myth they'd been handed or aligning with evidence that could stand in a courtroom, had made the only decision that would leave them standing. It was strange to realize that my presence on that screen had not been an act of acknowledgement but of compliance. Not respect. Self-preservation. They hadn't given me anything. They had returned what was already mine, because keeping it would have cost them more than they were willing to pay. I should have felt bitterness at that. Perhaps I did, in a low, steady way that didn't flare but stayed, like coals after a fire. But above it was something else. A deep, wordless satisfaction that the proof I had guarded so carefully had done its work without me lifting a hand in anger. The file names, the dates, the unbroken chain of edits, they had been my quiet witness all along. I thought about how many times I had hovered over the send button, tempted to unleash those drafts into the wild, to let outrage do what justice would not. And now I saw the difference. Outrage burns fast. Facts endure. They had bent, because the facts had left them no choice. That night I opened the folder again, not to add to it, but to see it with new eyes. Every line, every timestamp, every preserved truth was still there, untouched. And now I knew exactly what it was. Not a diary, not a weapon, but the root system beneath the visible tree. You could prune the branches. You could try to claim the fruit. But the roots stayed hidden, holding the ground, making sure the thing could not be moved without breaking. There was no announcement, no statement to correct the record, no public acknowledgement of what had been altered and why. The story moved forward as though nothing had happened, the machinery of promotion grinding on with its usual rhythm. But here and there, if you looked closely, the seams showed. Press releases were quietly updated, paragraphs rewritten to fold my name in without drawing attention. Database entries adjusted themselves overnight, shifting from omission to inclusion, with no trace of the hands that had made the change. PR managers rewrote their talking points, smoothing away the confident claims of sole authorship they had rehearsed so many times. The world outside might never notice the difference. To them, the project was a fixed shape now, and my presence in it looked like it had always been there. But I knew the truth. It had been stitched back in under pressure, and the threads were still warm from the work. There were no apologies, no explanations offered to me in private, but the corrections spoke in their own language, one I'd learned to read fluently. It was the language of retreat without confession, of conceding ground without raising a flag to mark the loss. And yet something had shifted in a way that didn't require words. The next time I was in the same room, the one where this had all begun, where my square on the screen had once been nothing but a muted observer, the air felt different. No one told me to watch and keep quiet. No one reminded me of my place. It wasn't respect exactly, but it was the absence of the casual dismissal that had been their default. My silence was no longer seen as emptiness. It was treated, however reluctantly, as presence. People spoke to me with an edge of caution now, measuring their words. I saw it in the way their eyes flicked to mine before making a claim, in the pauses that didn't used to be there. The authority in the room hadn't changed hands, but it had stopped pretending I wasn't holding any. And it wasn't because they suddenly believed in my talent or valued my voice. It was because they knew now I kept records. I kept truth. And truth had already proven it could surface when they least expected it. In that silence, I found the kind of justice that doesn't need ceremony. No applause, no reconciliation, just the knowledge that the balance had shifted, that the room itself had learned to live without the sentence that once defined my role. They would never say the words again, and I would never need to hear them to know I had dismantled them. When the final meeting ended, there was no applause, no ceremony, no closing speech. People simply began to stand, gathering their things in the quiet shuffle of chairs and muted conversations. I didn't rush to leave, but I didn't linger either. I rose at an even pace, my steps neither hurried nor hesitant. I moved toward the door, the way one leaves a place they no longer have to survive in, steady, unshaken, unmeasured by anyone else's clock. I wasn't first, I wasn't last. I was simply there in the center of my own stride, and that was enough. On the wall near the exit, the framed poster for the project hung in its final printed form. The credits were fixed now, ink on paper, the names locked into their order. My name sat there, clear and unaltered, in the place they had once worked so hard to keep empty. No one could erase it now without leaving a scar. I didn't stop to touch it, didn't trace the letters with my hand. I didn't need to. I had lived with their absence long enough to know the weight of their presence without proof. But I caught the way a few people glanced toward it as they passed, their eyes snagging briefly on the line that shouldn't have been there by their version of history. I knew what was in their minds. The same scene they had once tried to bury was still there, playing in their heads. The one line that had made the room stop breathing for a moment during the screening. The one they hadn't been able to claim because they knew, deep down, it didn't belong to them. That scene had survived every cut, every edit, every attempt to overwrite. And it would live on, not just on the screen, but in the recollection of anyone who had felt the shift it created. I stepped into the corridor and found that the air was different here, lighter, not because anything around me had changed, but because I was no longer carrying the weight of proving I had been part of this. That burden was gone. Now the truth existed outside of me, fixed in a place that didn't depend on my voice to hold it. My credit would remain on the wall whether I was in the building or halfway across the world. As I reached the outer doors, I thought of the sentence that had started it all. Watch. Don't speak. Back then, it had been a command, meant to diminish me. Now it felt like a choice I had turned into a weapon. I had spoken at the only moment that mattered, and not with noise or public spectacle, but with a precision they couldn't block. I pushed the door open and stepped outside into the cool air. Behind me, the poster stayed where it was, my name quietly watching the room that had once refused to hear it. And somewhere in that room, the people who had told me not to speak would have to keep walking past it, seeing it again and again, learning, slowly, reluctantly, how to say it out loud.